All right, here we go. Hey, Josh Tyree, thanks for coming. Cheryl Moosley, great to see your name here. Thank you guys so much. Thanks, everyone. We're just going to wait a few minutes and then we'll get going. A lot of new names here, which is wonderful. Welcome, everybody. We're just letting you all in, and then not long after, we'll get started. Welcome to the book club. Make yourselves comfortable. We'll start in a minute or two. Okay. All right, terrific. All right, let's get started. What the hell? I am B. Ruby Rich. I am the editor of Film Quarterly, and I want to welcome you to our online Page Views webinar, which we do with every issue to have a conversation with the author who's been featured in the issue with a new book, as chosen and as curated, you might say, by Bruno Guaraná, who's the editor of our Page Views section. Hey there. I want to welcome Hunter Hargraves, who's joining us. Hunter is at State Fullerton as an associate professor, and Bruno is master lecturer in film and media studies at Boston University in Boston. So we have them coast to coast today with you. And I'm joining from Paris, and really happy to be having this conversation to update all of us and all of you on what has happened to television, what perverse things have happened to television in this moment. And meanwhile, we have more people coming in. Hello, Sarah Kessler. Hello, Patty Zimmerman, many other people. So welcome, Girish. Have a seat, everybody, and we're going to get started. Welcome to our conversation about uncomfortable television, the title of Hunter Hargraves' book. And I want you to know that if you know anybody who's missing this today and wants to catch up, this will be posted online on the Film Quarterly website, where you can also find all of our past page views. And we'll have another one coming up this summer. We're going to be talking with Laurie Mulvey and Olivier Feck about a new book of scripts and articles on the Laura Mulvey and Peter Welland films. So that'll be the next page views in the summer, sometime in July. So meanwhile, we are here today with Hunter and Bruno. I'm going to turn over to you, Bruno. Take it away.
Thanks, Ruby. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today. And thanks for Hunter for agreeing to do this with us, as well as sharing his book. So I have a copy here, Uncomfortable Television. This is out from Duke University Press. We'll share an author code as well for discount later in the webinar. And I'll say a few words about the book before we start our conversation. And I'll remind everyone that our interview between myself and Hunter has been published in the latest issue of Film Quarterly under the Page Views column. So I'll start with the term of that sort of titles the book, right? So by uncomfortable television, Hunter means the kind of TV programming that dares viewers to keep watching as it pushes the envelope, dangling cultural affects of discomfort and opening wide the structures of feelings that were once associated with television pleasure. And this is the primary effective logic of what he calls postmillennial television, which loosely takes place in the first decade of the 2000s. But this kind of TV that's centered on discomfort is not at all completely unpleasant. In fact, as Hunter has said in our published interview, television trains us to take pleasure from discomfort as neoliberalism fully begins to wrap its tentacles around us. So we'll talk a little bit about neoliberalism as well. The lesson of processing discomfort that viewers get from TV is ultimately satisfying, it appears. By focusing on discomfort as this primary effective logic of a third golden age of television, Hunter bursts open the traditional TV canon that privileges series like The Sopranos, The Wire, and Mad Men in order to include next to them less revered but no less watched TV programming. In addition to prestige drama, the book covers comedies like HBO's Girls, the subgenre of reality TV that Hunter calls recovery television, and televisual remixes. So it's quite a wide range that discusses this new age of television. And I find this to be an important move because it disrupts the notion that prestige dramas are the driving force of contemporary programming and rejects the celebration of quality TV that takes place at the expense of TV as a medium more broadly. And here Hunter makes a contentious, a very pointed critique that it is these shows' racialized construction of spectatorship that enable their wide acclaim. So their status of prestige is only possible because the presumed viewer for them, which is the white privileged male, remains innocuous to the racial, sexual, and gender violence on which they project discomfort. In other words, the neoliberal ideology enabled by shows like The Wire is one that invites white viewers to play the role of social or institutional administrators, managing crises at a distance, and not just a distance that's afforded to them by the television medium itself, but also an epistemological distance, right? That of race, class, gender, and education as well. For Hunter, this means that discomfort and the way that TV employs it is not at all arbitrary, but follows a neoliberal logic. Starting in the 1990s and especially in the 2000s, American viewers are faced with televisual and televised effects of neoliberal policies that were implemented years earlier. This is also due to an industrial turn towards narrowcasting that prizes segmentation over an appeal to mass audiences, and that comes about at a time in which TV loses its centrality in the family room. So television programming increasingly addresses the individual over the family and niche demographics over mass audiences. For Hunter, the image of the family sitting before a TV set is in its way out with a show like American Idol. But more commonly now, individual family members will watch TV in more private spaces than in the living room. This both reflects and feeds back into an algorithmic understanding of viewership, in which taste is minutely profiled and audiences are ever more narrowly defined. So the era of what was once called least objectionable programming is coming to a close, paving the way to what could be called, and here I'm only half joking, most objectionable shows, right? Those that really push forward this idea of discomfort or even cringe viewing, right? As we'll talk about a little bit. But discomfort alone doesn't tell the whole story. And the book sort of pushes beyond the term of post-millennial television. So as life under the Trump presidency in particular became increasingly uncomfortable and routine TV news could not help but reproduce discomfort, Hunter notices a turn toward what he calls woke TV in response to the potential paralyzing effects of discomfort. Sure, television today still activates discomfort and other unpleasant feelings, but not as centrally as it did in the early 2000s. This is possible because discomfort is itself an elastic and conflicting affect that's capable of producing not just negative effects and negative feelings, but also pleasure, knowledge, and the kind of political consciousness that comes from indignation and irritation. So it seems like despite the displeasing aspects of discomfort, there is some positive value that can be taken from it, at the same time that it can be co-opted by a neoliberal ideology, right? So I'll end here. I think there's a lot of questions that can be generated from this discussion. Then I'll start by welcoming Hunter once again, and maybe, is there anything that I left out from this brief description of your book or something that needs to be corrected?
Thank you so much for that. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Ruby. Thank you, Bruno. And for everyone at the Film Quarterly team for this wonderful invitation. It's really exciting to be able to not only hold like a book, sorry for the blur right there, in my hand, but also to be able to talk television, which one of the changes that I highlight in the book to television that sometimes I think gets unnoticed is how TV criticism has been sort of democratized and sort of dispersed in different ways over the last 2 decades, not just through virtual fandoms, but just kind of like a reorganization and expansion of that whole sort of like discursive apparatus. So it makes sort of having a book about discomfort in television kind of really fun to promote in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, I'll certainly want to talk about this a little bit, the idea of measuring discomfort, right? And how do you know which texts are uncomfortable, besides just thinking about yourself as the primary receptor of that. But let's start with how you got interested in the idea of discomfort as an affect that seems to be pervasive in television.
Yeah, so this goes back, I think, probably to the mid to late 2000s, when I was really into Law and Order SVU, as a fan. It was sort of before we had sort of the language of binge viewing. I guess we called it sort of marathoning back then. And I just started to notice these wild plot lines that you would sort of see in individual episodes that really felt like they were kind of taking maybe some of the excessive narrative plotting from something like a Dynasty or a Dallas or something that was more sort of primetime melodrama, but really encapsulating it within sort of the structure of a sex crime and its sort of investigation. And it started getting me thinking about sort of not just the turn towards more or sort of the turn towards less censored programming, the way that you saw it on HBO throughout that decade, but it's network television. There's the ways in which shows like CSI and SVU were really investing in kind of sexual perversity as a way to sort of represent the detective genre or the police procedural during this time. That's what sort of, I think, really was the impetus and the initial spark for the book, in terms of thinking about like, okay, like this is supposed to be something that maybe aspires to a kind of realism in the way that like NYPD Blue did in the 90s or Hill Street Blues did in the 80s. And this is realistic in terms of the technology and in terms of, there certainly is that like gritty realism of Manhattan and Law and Order SVU, dark alleyways in which young Hudson University co-eds find themselves the victims of sexual assault. But the ways in which these sort of scenes of assault or these scenes of sexual violence became sort of dramatized felt remarkably different than the way that television had really sort of taken on such topics before. And then it was like, oh, okay, what about reality television? Reality television, as we know, in the 2000s explodes. It's in a very experimental stage, and some of that really not just summons sort of the affects of shame that we associate with like older programs like Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, or even Trump's own turn on The Apprentice and sort of the berating of contestants on like a regular basis. But also the ways in which we sort of like took the tragic sort of circumstances of quote unquote ordinary people and profiled them through these kinds of like faux documentary lens, or these sort of like documentary setups. So Intervention, Hoarders, shows in which we're really sort of diagnosing either severe sort of like mental health issues or, intense substance abuse issues. And that became sort of all on display. And it became just sort of this accumulative sort of effect in which it was just sort of all like, wow, it's not just in one genre. And it's, as you were saying, Bruno, in the sort of wonderful introduction, it's not just in these prestige shows like The Sopranos or The Wire that often get a lot of attention for their scenes of violence or for the ways in which they sort of push the envelope. But it's on A&E, it's on TLC, it's on NBC and CBS, it's across these different networks. So even as television is sort of changing in this, in the early part of the millennium from, moving between kind of this older network legacy model of broadcasting and now, to something that's much more digitally sort of anchored and narrowcasted, scenes of discomfort are everywhere. And that's really where I started to sort of think about, okay, like now that we're seeing this across different genres, there's something in the ether here.
Yeah, it seems like, it starts off with a sort of a shock from watching a show that should be going towards realism, as you say, but it doesn't, right? And then it's the unexpected, I guess, avenue in which it's being displayed, right? In this case in particular, it was on network television, you said?
It was on network television, but, this was also, I think the 2000s are a sort of interesting decade to think about technology-wise, just because so much of the technology forms that were really crucial are now finally like completely outdated, right? Like DVDs no longer have the same sort of like importance in the, you know, the larger TV merchandising economy. And, you know, so the idea in which you could sort of like buy a DVD box set of a series, and I remember at the time like going to like independent like record and film stores in the Bay Area and looking for these DVD box sets of TV shows in order to sort of, again, marathon these programs. That's what really sort of, it was when we were in these embryonic stages of a lot of these changes to television spectatorship. And they all seem to be ensconced in sort of relations of discomfort.
Yeah. How do you, we'll go back to that question of the 2000 in particular, what makes that moment ripe for this appearance, but how do you measure discomfort, or rather, how do you even study discomfort, given that it's so contingent on a subjective response?
Yeah, I think as a queer white male, my understanding of discomfort might be very different than others. I think one of the sort of wonderful interventions of affect theory throughout the early 21st century got us thinking about sort of the ways in which raced, queered affects all help understand our own relation to sort of like cultural texts. So I acknowledge in the book, and that's one of the reasons why the book focuses, I think, a lot on whiteness as a sort of like audience category and sort of like privileged form of spectatorship for a lot of these programs. But I do think that we can measure discomfort beyond a sort of individual personalized response, in part through what I was sort of saying earlier about the sort of democratization of television criticism that appeared throughout the 2000s and 2010s. So it's not just that you're watching a program and saying like, okay, this is creepy, I'm cringing, right? But then you go on Twitter and everyone else is available for a kind of group cringe therapy session, right? Or you can go to websites like back in, you know, the 2000s, Television Without Pity, or now the AV Club, Vulture, and you can read recaps and all kinds of like paratextual kinds of columns and think pieces that are also about a group sort of working through of different kinds of like spectatorial reactions. So I think that has a lot to do with how we can sort of like measure discomfort, that it's in part because many of these new avenues for debating, discussing, speculating to different kinds of television narratives, like also really, they privilege affective like grammars and languages. And that becomes, I think, a really important way in which we are able sort of socially to perceive these new sort of emergent structures of feeling of discomfort in television.
Yeah, it almost sounds like.
Can I pop in for a second, Bruno? I just wanted to ask Hunter. I'm just intrigued by how you just phrased that in terms of the whiteness of presumed spectators. So, whose discomfort is being mined for whose discomfort? You know, who is being sacrificed here, and who is being quasi entertained? And I wonder if you could just tease that out a bit more, because that went by kind of fast.
Oh, it's more just to sort of acknowledge that I think during this time, we see a lot of changes to the television industry in terms of how they're thinking about the question of the audience, right? It's like we're in a kind of like intense narrowcasting stage that has been set by the 80s and the 90s. And it really ramps up, I think, in the 2000s as more and more networks are starting to have the technological tools to like target more and more precise audiences. That being said, I think that, you know, the 2000s are still a period of time in which like we're not really thinking on a level, we're still in kind of maybe older models of thinking about certainly race and kind of demographic, the demographics of spectatorship. So for me, as like a white audience member, I'm certainly cognizant of, or at least I hope I'm cognizant of how my whiteness might inflect sort of different scenes of discomfort. When I watch Law and Order SVU and I see a lot of specifically gendered like scenes of violence, as a queer male, like I have a maybe different relationship to it than say a young woman who often perceives the threat of sexual violence on a much more visceral scale or day-to-day basis. That being said, I think the ways in which we connect maybe the sort of the content of these series with the sort of the discourses about them can often lead to these kinds of racialized sort of like audience formation. So in the case of these prestige TV shows like The Sopranos or The Wire or Mad Men, what you are seeing is white men behaving badly, right? Like this is even the name of sort of Brett Martin's hagiographic study of these programs is Difficult Men. And I kind of want to push and pressure some of those logics and say like, okay, but in the process of sort of valorizing this anti-hero, you're in many respects like sort of inadvertently and maybe explicitly too, privileging this sort of like white male like kind of spectator. But there's always this kind of like twist of discomfort that both enables these like processes of identification with these like, tortured, conflicted anti-heroes, while also providing the safe space for you as an audience member to say like, oh, I'm not that bad. I'm not like as ethically sort of corrupt. And so that's why I'm interested in kind of formulations of like white guilt, for example, and that might motivate why these, sophisticated audiences that are supposedly attracted to prestige TV in the 2000s are interested in series like The Wire that really are trying to emphasize kind of like the breakdown of race relations or the breakdown of sort of like the neoliberal city, or in Breaking Bad, a show in which quite literally a man with the last name of White ends up kind of witness to and participant in sort of like a mass murdering several or is witness to the deaths of several sort of like characters of color throughout the entire series. So there becomes, I think, a way in which like sometimes white guilt or the feelings of that are sort of often attached to whiteness become imbricated in some of the ways in which we sort of identify and disidentify from a lot of these programs.
It's interesting because this is the kind of critique that a show like Girls would get, right? So like the centrality of whiteness and perhaps the blindness towards diversity, or the forced way in which you try to embrace diversity. Can you talk a little bit about the reception of Girls, and also how you kind of try to put a positive spin in what the show is trying to do at the same time that it is also to a fault with that?
Girls is a great example of both that kind of connects a lot of the threads that I've been talking about so far. Insofar as like, as soon as Girls came out, even before the pilot had dropped and we were just looking at promotional materials of the show back in sort of like around 2010, 2011, it was like all of a sudden there was just like an avalanche of think pieces that would say sort of like, Girls is too white, Girls is too privileged, Girls, they're all Nepo babies, like even though we didn't have that, like even though we weren't quite using that term yet either, but we were pointing out kind of like the logics of privilege and power within sort of the series, and the think piece became kind of like the dominant form through which to sort of articulate these sort of concerns of disidentification. Girls is acutely aware of this, throughout its 7-season run. And there's a point in which I think you can kind of look between like the first and the second season of the show and see how the show is trying to incorporate a lot of these critiques about it being like too white, too irritating, too privileged. And we might not look at them as sort of sincere attempts to sort of address its whiteness or something like that, but the show is at least engaging in an effort to sort of address these critiques. One of the ways in which it does so is through the sort of the affective logic of irritation. Lena Dunham both playing an irritating and irritated character, Hannah in Girls, and also Lena Dunham's celebrity sort of image herself being one that feels kind of irritating on the level of the larger kind of like celebrity economy. You know, there are a number of, I guess, Twitter controversies, or, you know, like, you know, kind of social media faux pas that Dunham has made over the years that have just kind of like, I think, contributed to her brand being that of kind of like the irritating millennial feminist, white feminist. So that's how the series is sort of, I think, presented to a lot of viewers. But I think there's also something really profoundly fascinating in how the series sort of thinks about the troll as a sort of central figure of this. It always wants to be sort of trolling its critics. It always wants to be sort of like trolling older generations for leaving the women of girls an impoverished kind of economic landscape, one in which they don't have the same kind of access to sort of post-feminist narratives of class mobility the way that, say, Sex and the City did. So there's a lot of comparisons in the city a lot of comparisons in the series between the four protagonists and the four protagonists of Sex and the City, and they're always sort of pointing out how like they can't be that, right? Like, but they do so in like the most irritating sort of fashion, right? And like the scenes that the episodes that I sort of look at within the chapter on girls in the book are these episodes like in the second season, in which in part to sort of respond to these critiques of whiteness, Donald Glover comes on in a couple episode arc to be like her sort of like Black boyfriend, and they are truly cringeworthy scenes watching Hannah Dunham's character try to both sort of justify her relationship or her interest in this boy, like for reasons other than his race, while also, you know, trying to defend herself as like a kind of like good woke millennial feminist, though again, like she's not using those words. We didn't have those words at the time. So there's a lot of layers that are going on in terms of how irritation is constructed. And even though irritation is never really thought of as a really productive kind of affect, it's really sort of thought about in very sort of neutered terms, or with a very limited sort of like political potential. But I'm really interested in how the series wants to sort of use the conceit of being an irritated character or having an irritating celebrity sort of presence as a way to sort of call out these larger sort of like neoliberal, like these structures of neoliberal sort of precarity. And it's not pleasure in a traditional sense. It's not a pleasure that's going to go to that kind of like ha 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 ha. It's a darker sort of form of pleasure. It's one in which you have to sort of take the pleasure where you can find it, but it's still an effective form of pleasure nonetheless. And I'm really sort of interested in how we maybe the mental gymnastics that we as spectators go through in order to kind of secure that pleasure.
I like the idea of the troll because it sort of suggests that the show really embraces its format as television, right? Like its ability to actually respond to critique and sort of establish a almost direct dialogue with the audience and its critics as well, right?
There was a moment in an earlier sort of draft of that work in which I made a much more sort of explicit comparison between Lena Dunham and Donald Trump in terms of like how they were sort of both in terms of how pleasure for them was the pleasure of trolling. Like that's the only, it almost seemed like the ways in which like both of these characters saw their sort of themselves in relation to their sort of environment. It was almost as if like trolling others or calling out others was the only ways in which one could secure that kind of like personal pleasure.
Right.
And that to me is a very neoliberal feeling, right? It's you, it's us all on our like those awful healthcare automated voicemail systems where we're just trying to like get through to someone and we just feel so like irritated and frustrated. And that, you know, it's those kinds of affects that I think come together in order to sort of create this now character, like this now trope of the irritating sort of or entitled millennial.
Yeah, and one of the ways I think in which you discuss a protection that on the part of the viewer, I think from this discomfort or from this trolling is the construction of the ironic viewer. I find that concept to be really intriguing. And I want us to talk a little bit about that. Like, where does the ironic viewer come from? And you talk about, he or she in particular, about the in relationship to the reality television, right? So tell us a little bit about the idea of the ironic viewer.
Well, ironic viewing, initially, hold on, there's a motorcycle in the background. Ironic viewing initially was a term used by Ian Ang in her work on Dallas to sort of think through the ways in which one can sort of make identifications and attachments to characters that absolutely have no sort of like relationship to you in terms of class status or sort of lifestyle. And I sort of use the term a little bit differently. The way that it's been sort of taken up in different reality TV discourses by people like Susan Douglas, for example, is to sort of say like, okay, like irony is the predominant way in which many of us watch reality television. It's in part because reality television focuses on kind of like the exploitation of these sort of like ordinary people and their sort of tragic dramas. Addiction, hoarding, so on and so forth. And yet it establishes this sort of like relationship in which like you say like, okay, like I may have my own vices, I may have my own sort of flaws, but I'm not at rock bottom. And that also goes for lots of different kinds of reality television, right? As I was starting to conceive of this project, Jersey Shore comes onto the scene, right? Like, and becomes a kind of like cultural phenomenon for a hot second. And there's another way in which like, I think a lot of us were able to sort of look at, you know, those kinds of programs in a much different way than something like The Real World was in the early 90s, in which there was maybe more of a sincere relationship of viewing in which you would watch The Real World, not because you wanted to feel better than the antics of these like drunk 20-somethings, but because you were actually invested in seeing how they came together to sort of like work through their sort of like multicultural differences. But in reality television of the 2000s and especially into the early 2010s, ironic viewing becomes sort of the primary way which we describe so many sort of, I think, reality TV fandoms. It's in our language about The Bachelor and certainly reality dating programs. And I think that kind of ironic viewing is really useful for explaining why we are attracted to sort of guilty pleasures, but it doesn't always explain why we are attracted to watching the sort of the exploitative factors of reality television. So in the chapter on reality television, in which I look predominantly at the show Intervention and do a sort of close reading of an episode of that series, I'm really interested in the ways in which like the show itself like bounces around between it's a fake documentary at first. It has this very deliberate narrative staging in which you're introduced to an addict. You watch them at rock bottom, you hear from friends and family, and it creates almost a kind of like narrative structure for the episode that in many respects mirrors the kinds of structural sort of discourses of how we look at addiction in society, not just through like 12-step programs, but just with another sort of cultural shift during this time is that we've all started to, I think, use the language and discourse of mental health and addiction in like much more sophisticated and nuanced ways. And so we're able as a viewing public to be able to sort of like connect those dots and see within maybe an episode of Intervention our own kind of ups and downs and relationships to different sort of structures of moderation. And I think importantly for reality television, which was always sort of characterized as this cheaply produced, non-unionized, we're in another writer's strike. The last writer's strike was sort of is often thought of as like the reason why so reality television like really increased its gravitational hold on people. And I think a lot of that has to do with how we might use these sort of structures and affects and affective relationships on television to really justify our own addiction to television, which, during the 2000s and 2010s starts to usher in this new era of like binging, marathon viewing, having unlimited access to content, and thus our time becomes invested in that wholly.
Right. Is the ironic viewer in some ways immune to the discomfort of these shows?
No, I don't think they're immune to the discomfort. I think, you can watch an episode of Intervention and feel discomfort in so many different registers, right? Not just in terms of like the empathy that comes, the empathy that might come with watching someone at rock bottom, but frustration with family members, frustration maybe with the interventionist, like frustration with the producers, or, that you feel might be sort of crossing a line. And I feel like ironic viewing is often used as a very sort of convenient way to excuse or to work through a lot of those like sort of feelings. Again, the mental gymnastics that sort of come with like, how do we diffuse discomfort when we sort of like affectively sense it? But it's not the only sort of technique, right? Because so many reality programs, especially reality programs that are sort of profiling these sort of really intense scenes, are styling themselves as documentaries or as docu-series, like more than like maybe like reality, even though that's obviously what they are.
Right.
I'm going to cut in, Bruno, because we lost Ruby. But maybe we could just turn to the chat where I put Sarah Kessler's question.
Oh, sure.
Hunter can respond to that. So do you want to read it, Bruno?
Yeah, sure. So Sarah's asking, can you speak a bit to how the kind of viewer irritation you mentioned with respect to girls, for example, plays out within, over, or cross binge watching as a mode of TV consumption? What's at stake in the compulsion to continue being irritated over the course of a binge?
Thank you so much for that question, Sarah. I think with a show like Girls, so with a show like Girls, the irritation that you might feel as a viewer who just cannot see a character like Hannah, or even a celebrity persona like Dunham, like get her shit together throughout like 7 seasons in a way that like can feel narratively satisfying for a viewer, or feels like, okay, like we're finally ready to root for you, right? Like you may have crossed over from being the anti-hero to now finally like the heroine of the story, in a more traditional sense. I think, when Girls comes out, we're not quite yet in the language of the binge, but now of course we are. And I think it's really interesting how over the last couple months there's started to be more think pieces. There was a big article in the New York Times about how like a lot of viewers are now revisiting Girls and sort of the moment from the early sort of 2010s in which that sort of very limited sort of idea of what the millennial sort of post-feminism could be. We're revisiting that. And I think, Girls it's HBO, it's coming out on a week-to-week basis. HBO is really pushing a marketing strategy in which it sort of says, like, we want you to watch these shows on a week-to-week basis. We want you to engage with the larger sort of think piece economy that that helps structure the fandom for this sort of series. But it's also HBO. It says like, hey, if you can't get to it, we can give you, you will be able to watch this like over and over again later on. I think it's interesting that like we start to develop these vocabularies of like hate watching and sort of anti-fandom throughout the 2000s and 2010s as well. I'm not necessarily sure it's always tied to sort of some of the more visceral feelings of discomfort that I'm interested in the book. It can be, right? Like being irritated often describes a lot of viewing postures that we as audiences have, especially when it comes to really sort of like intricate and complex forms of storytelling. So you might feel like an irritated viewer when you are invested in a show, and then all of a sudden it's season 5 and they're doing something that you're totally not on board with. A show is jumping the shark in its final season, or as we're seeing a lot now in our sort of adaptation heavy economy, when a text is being adapted from a different sort of source material and there's not quite that level of fidelity. Fans get irritated, fans get frustrated, and those have now all been sort of like legitimized as as forms of viewing. What Girls, I think, is really sort of significant in helping accelerate that the mainstreaming of kind of hate watching or frustrated viewing or irritated viewing is in how it is from the beginning tying its irritation to a larger like discursive apparatus of talking about television. So it's one of, I think, the first series that is really able to successfully harness all of its outrage into the show itself, and to really like absorb those critiques and to try to respond to those critiques. There's two, in the 3rd season of Girls, there's a really sort of, I think, well-known episode that I talk about in the book called Beach House, in which the 4 friends are in a Hamptons house for the weekend, and one of them, Shoshana, decides to just go off on all of them, and she just like cuts into them with these like very intense jabs and reads. And they survive. It's still operating within the logic of a television series, and there is reconciliation. At the end of the series, in the sort of the penultimate episode, there's another kind of scene in which Shoshana goes off again and sort of indicts the group in under the terms of their sort of like bad friendship, and the friend group falls apart really at the end. And I think when you're following a show like Girls, the ways in which we can kind of binge a show, the way in which we can sort of consume it season by season or as an entire text over the course of an entire month or something like that, I think a lot of those sort of affective dynamics certainly allow you, for the viewer, to feel like irritated and frustrated. But because the show is actually, at the time was being released on this sort of week-to-week distribution model, you then had to turn to all of these other fora in order to sort of really register that and sort of process that kind of irritation. So I think there's maybe, 2 different ways that we can sort of like locate that, right? Like one of the things I always sort of tell my students is really think about like what sort of behavioral habits are linked to your binge viewing. And to think about those in affective terms, like when you binge 6 episodes of Girls on a weekend because that's what you're going to do this weekend, you might not remember what happens in that 4th episode that you watched, right? But the ways in which you're sort of making sense of the overall storyline is in terms of how much you hated Hannah in the 1st episode, and then how you liked her more in the 2nd episode, or you're thinking about it on the terms of sort of like character growth, character change, or not, and that's often how you end up categorizing your sort of affective reactions.
Yeah. Just to take the pressure off of Hannah and Lena Dunham, I noticed that you also talk about a very historically situated Louis C.K. Before his being reprimanded apart from within his own universe. And I wonder what you say about that now. Obviously, this is published since his disgrace and since his weird redemption.
Return. Mm-hmm.
But I also wonder what you think about that in contrast to the kind of irritating personae of someone like a Hannah Gadsby or like a Tig Notaro. Like, how is uncomfortableness gendered, and what are the consequences? Who pays, and how do people pay differently? I'm curious about this in your work.
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you, Ruby. I'm really interested in Louis C.K.'s comedy, not because I'm a fan of it by any stretch of the imagination, but because of the uncanny ways in which it seemed to sort of like telegraph his own flaws. The ways in which he, you know, both Lena Dunham and Louis C.K. In their shows, which are, you know, both fictionalized versions of their own sort of lives, but that the extent to which we recognize that as a fictionalization or buy into it is I think really sort of crucial in sort of both getting you to identify with the character and distance yourself from that character, right? Louis C.K. does an episode in 2010 called Come On, God, in which it's about masturbation. It starts with him appearing on the Fox News late night program with Greg Gutfeld talking about masturbation. It has these kinds of fantasy sequences where he's in an elevator trying to like hit on this hot woman in the elevator who's trying in very sort of like exaggerated pouty lipped language to say put a bag of dicks in me. And he then has this sort of intense interaction with the woman that he's debating on this Fox News program, who's kind of against masturbation and represents a more kind of like monogamous Christian sort of like perspective on sexual sort of purity. The episode makes it very clear that Louis is sort of disgusted with how much he masturbates. It doesn't represent it in any kind of positive terminology whatsoever. And it's really sort of in a kind of almost nihilistic way, really down on the ability for straight men, though that sort of distinction is never really explored. It's always sort of presumed to be straight. Like this idea that like all straight men masturbate in order to sort of excuse their presumably much worse perversions. What interests me about like Louis C.K. and to kind of then get to your question, Ruby, about the gendering of this is how, again, in this sort of expanded realm of TV criticism, Louis was not very few TV critics, very few think pieces were written in the wake of this, you know, Louis C.K. episode about how fucking creepy it is. Like, in fact, a lot of TV critics turn to those early seasons of Louis precisely in these like very rhapsodic terms, like, oh my gosh, it's so formally interesting. It's taking kind of like this single camera, like vignette side of storytelling, which wasn't super popular on a lot of cable series. And it's feeling very, you know, it's auteurist, it's, you know, and a lot of those comparisons were ironically enough to kind of like the work of Woody Allen, right? Like another sort of high profile, controversial Hollywood auteur for, you know, when it comes to questions of sexual perversion, right? So I think, you know, what was interesting to me is how a number of these critics in their recaps of the series and in the ways in which they wanted to sort of place Louis into the pantheon of like comedy, were just so willing to sort of excuse the subject matter, in part because it was read as a kind of like formal plus, a formal innovation. And so that's, to me, is a great example of how sort of television acculturated its audiences to feel discomfort, or to sort of work through their discomfort, to maybe even excuse their discomfort, in part through like privileging these formal sort of innovations. But I do think it plays out like on an incredibly sort of like gendered, a gendered level. And you even see that within how like the gendering of TV criticism, right? In which like most of the books that have been written about that, you know, that golden age of TV in the 2000s and early 2010s are written by men who don't really want to sort of like read too much into the sort of the bad behavior that a lot of these protagonists are doing, or they just sort of take it for granted in a way that I don't think Lena Dunham was ever given the sort of the space to do.
We have the sort of the downfall of Louis C.K. as well as Girls' sort of exit that seems to be very self-referential, right? With Shoshana sort of blowing out and sort of saying like there's no way for us to continue as friends, there's no ways for us to continue as a show. But we see other sort of, I think you explained this in the book as well, but we see discomfort sort of going away a little bit. There's some justification for it, I think, with the appearance of Trump and his politics and the discomfort that becomes more generalized, right? And leaves the TV screen and becomes apparent in our lives. But also the Me Too movement, I think, conversations about traumas from racial violence and the representation of racial violence and how that generates more traumas, right? There seems to be an acknowledgement on the part of the shows as well as on the part of critics and viewers that there's a limit to the discomfort, right? When it touches too close to trauma and triggering. So what happens to discomfort and when does it happen?
So this is,
at
I
the
think,
end of this post-millennial television phase.
Yeah.
Great question.
Yeah, thanks. Because this was, I think while I was writing the book, I was, the flashy title, Uncomfortable Television. It's like, okay, like this is almost like a static category, but it's not, right? The book is in many respects like a very specific historically situated book that says
Right.
like, it's really from like the early 2000s to the mid 2010s that I'm looking at how discomfort kind of slips under the radar, right? So that way, when we're talking about television, we're talking about Lena Dunham as an auteur or her like kind of bizarre politics of representation. We're talking about Louis C.K.'s like innovative comedy. We're not talking about how gross it is that he's like just like masturbating out of frame, like in front of all these women. So the book sort of says like, okay, this is when we see a lot of the changes to television that are sort of well recognized in terms of technological agency or formal innovation or the expansion of certain genres like the prestige serialized drama or reality television. As I'm writing the book in the late 2010s and sort of trying to periodize this, it's like, okay, everything is changing again. We've got streaming companies that have like completely disrupted the traditional sort of like mode of distribution. We've got Trump, who has sort of taken the styles and the sort of the tone of reality television and sort of restructured a lot of political discourse around those affects. And we've also got so I started to see a lot of these sort of televisual relations change insofar as it was like, okay, like actually now maybe after 15 years of sort of being acculturated to these uncomfortable narratives on television, we are now a more sophisticated viewing public who can recognize how that has happened over the last 15 years. And so now maybe the ways in which we're like looking at discomfort feels, now that we're able to recognize it better, we're then able to sort of weaponize our discomfort in the service of social change. And periodization of television is, as I say in the sort of the conclusion to the book, it's a really fraught task, right? Because television itself, stretches years and years and years, and that doesn't always conform to the neater ways in which we often try to categorize or periodize different structures of feeling or sort of political formations. So the end of the book turns towards sort of the late 2010s as a time in which all of a sudden television became woke. And by that, I mean, I'm thinking about especially how it became woke with respect to the understanding and recognition and processing of discomfort. So the one show that I like to talk about, or that I address in that chapter at the end, is The Handmaid's Tale, in which, just like Law and Order SVU and CSI, there would be sort of scenes of sexual violence sort of replicated on a week-by-week basis. But here, in part because it's serialized and prestige and on a streaming service, but also in part because of the series release coinciding with the sort of opening months of the Trump administration, all of a sudden spectators have a desire to do something with their discomfort in a way that they never had with the sort of the victims of sexual assault in the 2000s, on SVU or CSI. So here you had a lot of sort of feminist discourses saying like, well, watching The Handmaid's Tale is really intense, and I can't always be looking at the screen, but I feel like I have to watch it in order to like demonstrate my resistance to Trump, or I have to be sort of like invested in the narrative in order to like to resist the administration. And then you even see this playing out on the level of like individual activism, in which protesters would show up to state legislatures who are debating sort of more restrictive reproductive rights in full-on Handmaid's sort of like cosplay.
Right.
And so that's what got me thinking a lot about maybe how now we process our discomfort in more sort of explicitly political ways.
I'm going to interrupt because we're almost out of time, and a really interesting question just came in that's on a totally different subject from Melissa Pruxashart saying, hello, Hunter. And she says, first of all, really, Girls had 7 seasons, LOL. But her question is actually about The Office and its use of cinema verite techniques to produce discomfort. And she cites Ethan Thompson's writing on this. It says, does The Office or the docu-sitcom play it all into your analysis in terms of the crystallization of neoliberal affects?
I am loath.
That's going to be our last question for you.
I am loath to give too much attention to The Office just because it's not a show I like to think about too much, to be perfectly honest. Some of my students say that they fall asleep to The Office, and it just really, it's a kind of a mind fuck to me, like how you can find sort of solace and comfort in a lot of that cringe. But thank you, Melissa, for that question. And I would just sort of say, I don't necessarily think about it in maybe the sitcom logic. The opening of the book, I think, does what I really like is a comparison between that episode of Louis C.K. in which he's sort of talking about masturbation, and thus using a lot of those single camera cinema verite techniques to get at the awkwardness and cringeness of Louis C.K. masturbating in front of women or just masturbating at home sort of casually. And I compare that to Seinfeld and the episode of the sort of the classic episode of Seinfeld from 1992 about masturbation called The Contest. In which they're all the four friends are like on a bet to see who can go the longest without masturbating. And those are both kind of slightly fictionalized versions of a stand-up comedian's life. And they both sort of integrate stand-up comedy, the scenes of stand-up comedy, into their sort of narrative frameworks. And so that's how I sort of initially think about kind of like this role of cringe. Like, why is Louis so uncomfortable to watch when Seinfeld, they're both talking about masturbation, but one is doing it through like wordplay and euphemism and using the techniques of like conventional sitcom comedy to like diffuse whatever discomfort you may have from hearing about masturbation, versus something like Louis, which is doing so in these like really formally innovative cinema verite inspired sort of like turns, and in which the discomfort is sort of like, I think, privileged a lot more. So that's how I think a lot about maybe some of the ways in which we see the sitcom or the comedy, the sort of the docu-comedy move into the terrain of discomfort. The Office, I think, is really, interesting, as you're pointing out in your question, to how it speaks to kind of like the conditions of late capitalism in the workplace. But I don't know. There's something about Steve Carell that just it's a visceral level of discomfort for me that I can't even it's binging that would be a form of torture that I don't want to necessarily imagine right now.
So now we have found the limits of your discomfort.
The limits of my
and-
discomfort is the
and-
office. Exactly.
And we are exactly at the limit of our time. So that's a very good coinciding. Bruno, thank you. Hunter, thank you. And I think we have here pasted into the chat the link to your book, the code for the 30% discount, and also for everybody, if you go on to page views on the Film Quarterly website, you also find a chapter of the book for download. So we've got you fully equipped, and tune in come summer. Come back and hear presumably a very different discourse with Laura Mulvey talking about the new anthology on the early work that you did with Peter Wolin.
I would love to know Laura Mulvey's limits of discomfort.
Okay, well, tune in. Thank you both, and thank you
Thanks,
everyone
everybody.
for coming. It's been a great session. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Bye.